People think avoidant individuals don't want love. That is the biggest misunderstanding of all. They crave love deeply. They crave connection. They crave safety. But the moment intimacy gets close enough to touch the wounds they've spent years hiding, they pull away. Not because they don't care, because caring feels dangerous. And if you truly want to understand an avoidant heart, you must understand this. They are fighting two battles at the same time. One part of them is screaming, "Please stay." The other part is terrified, whispering, "If you stay long enough, you'll eventually hurt me." That inner conflict creates distance, silence, mixed signals, emotional walls. But underneath those walls is not coldness. It's fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of rejection. Fear of needing someone too much. Fear that vulnerability will cost them their freedom, identity, or emotional survival. And here's what most people never realize. Avoidants often long for intimacy more than anyone. Else because they have deprived themselves of it for so long. They want someone who feels emotionally safe, someone who doesn't weaponize vulnerability, someone who understands that trust for them is not given instantly, it is earned slowly, painfully, layer by layer. But because they struggle to express these needs directly, they often communicate through withdrawal instead of words. They don't say, "I'm overwhelmed." They disappear. They don't say, "I'm scared you'll reject me." They become distant first. They don't say, "I need reassurance." They pretend they don't need anything at all. And the tragedy is this. The very strategies they use to protect themselves are the same strategies that prevent the love they desire. But transformation begins the moment awareness enters the room. The moment they realize, avoiding pain is also avoiding connection. Avoiding vulnerability is also avoiding love. Avoiding emotional risk is also avoiding emotional fulfillment. Real inti. Spacey is not control. It is courage. The courage to be seen without armor. The courage to speak needs without shame. The courage to stay emotionally present even when fear says run. Because healing does not happen when someone finally finds the perfect partner. Healing happens when someone stops treating vulnerability like an enemy. And when an avoidant finally learns that intimacy is not a trap, it becomes freedom. Many people misunderstand avoidant individuals because they confuse emotional distance with emotional emptiness. But those are not the same thing. An avoidant person can feel love intensely and still struggle to express it openly. They can crave closeness while simultaneously resisting it. And if you only judge them by their behavior on the surface, you will completely miss the emotional storm happening underneath. The truth is, avoidants often experience deep emotional needs they rarely speak about. They want connection just like everyone else. They want to feel chosen, and valued, understood, and emotionally safe. They want someone who sees beyond their walls without trying to destroy them. But somewhere along the way, they learned that vulnerability came with pain. Maybe they grew up in environments where emotions were ignored, criticized, or dismissed. Maybe they learned that depending on others led to disappointment. So instead of expressing needs openly, they trained themselves to survive without needing too much from anyone. That survival strategy may protect them from immediate emotional pain, but it also creates loneliness, because human beings are wired for connection. No matter how independent someone appears, there is still a part of them that wants closeness. The avoidant individual often becomes trapped between two powerful desires, the desire to connect and the desire to protect themselves. That internal contradiction creates confusion not only for others, but for themselves as well. When intimacy begins to grow, something inside them becomes uncomfortable. Not because the connection is bad, but because it starts touching emotional territory they have spent years avoiding. Real intimacy requires openness. It requires honesty. It requires emotional exposure. And for someone who has associated vulnerability with danger, that exposure can feel overwhelming. Their nervous system interprets closeness as risk instead of safety. This is why avoidants may pull away right when things begin getting serious. It is not always because they stopped caring. In many cases, they care so deeply that the fear becomes stronger. They begin worrying about losing themselves in the relationship. They fear being controlled, disappointed, abandoned, or emotionally consumed. So instead of leaning in, they create distance. They may become quieter, harder to reach, emotionally unavailable, or hyper-focused on independence. From the outside, it can look cold, but internally, they are often struggling with emotions they do not know how to regulate. Communicate. One of the greatest misconceptions about avoidance is that they do not need reassurance. In reality, many of them desperately need reassurance but feel ashamed to ask for it. Asking for emotional support can feel weak or unsafe to them. So they pretend they are fine even when they are hurting. They suppress emotions instead of expressing them. They minimize needs instead of voicing them. Over time, this creates emotional isolation. And yet, despite all of this, avoidants still dream about deep connection. They still imagine relationships where they can relax emotionally without fear. They still want to feel accepted without pressure, loved without judgment, and understood without being forced to become emotionally exposed before they are ready. Beneath the emotional armor is often someone who has simply become exhausted from protecting themselves for too long. What makes avoidance difficult to understand is that their actions and feelings often contradict each other. Or they may miss someone deeply while avoiding their messages. They may love someone while struggling to say it consistently. They may want intimacy while resisting the very behaviors that create intimacy. This contradiction confuses partners, but it also confuses the avoidant person themselves. Many of them secretly wonder why closeness feels so difficult when they genuinely want love. The answer is not that they are incapable of connection. The answer is that fear has become stronger than trust. And until emotional safety begins replacing emotional fear, they will continue protecting themselves in ways that push people away. Inside an avoidant person, there is often a silent war taking place every single day. One side of them longs for connection, closeness, affection, and emotional safety. The other side fears exactly those same things. They want intimacy, but intimacy also threatens the emotional defenses they spent years building. This is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. They move closer, then suddenly pull away. They open up emotionally, then become distant. They crave love deeply, yet panic when love becomes too real. To understand this conflict, you have to understand that fear and desire can exist in the same heart at the same time. Human emotions are not always logical. A person can genuinely love someone while still being terrified of emotional dependence. They can want commitment while also fearing what commitment demands emotionally. This contradiction is exhausting for the avoidant individual because they are constantly fighting themselves internally. Many avoidants learned early in life that emotional closeness came with risk. Perhaps vulnerability was met with criticism, neglect, inconsistency, or disappointment. Over time, they adapted by becoming emotionally self-reliant. Independence became their identity. They learned to trust themselves more than they trusted connection. So when someone finally enters their life and begins breaking, through those walls, the experience feels both beautiful and threatening at the same time. Part of them feels relief because someone finally sees them. Another part feels panic because now they can also be hurt. This is why avoidance may seem calm externally while internally experiencing intense emotional pressure. They may deeply enjoy spending time with someone, but afterward feel emotionally overwhelmed and suddenly need space. They may want closeness one moment and isolation the next. Their nervous system struggles to balance intimacy with emotional safety. As feelings deepen, fear often grows alongside them. One of the biggest fears avoidants carry is the fear of losing themselves inside a relationship. They fear becoming emotionally dependent because dependence feels dangerous to them. To many avoidants, needing someone creates vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like surrendering control. They may worry that if they fully attach to someone, they will eventually be abandoned. One, disappointed, trapped, or emotionally consumed. So even when they care deeply, they instinctively protect themselves by creating distance. Sometimes this fear shows up subtly. They may delay responding to messages, avoid emotional conversations, or become uncomfortable with too much affection. Other times it becomes more extreme. They may suddenly withdraw after moments of deep intimacy, question the relationship for no clear reason, or focus excessively on flaws and imperfections to create emotional distance. These behaviors are not always intentional manipulation. Often they are unconscious protective responses driven by fear. What makes this especially painful is that avoidants often do not fully understand their own reactions. They may genuinely ask themselves, why am I pulling away from someone I care about? The answer is not lack of feeling. In many cases, the feelings are actually very strong. Strong emotions trigger vulnerability, and vulnerability activates fear. The stronger the emotional bond becomes, the more exposed they feel. This creates an emotional push and pull dynamic. They want reassurance, but fear appearing needy. They want closeness, but fear losing independence. They want to trust someone fully, but struggle to believe emotional safety will last. As a result, they often send mixed signals that confuse partners. One day they seem deeply connected and emotionally available. The next day they appear distant and detached. At the core of this conflict is not cruelty or emotional coldness. It is self-protection. The avoidant individual has learned to associate emotional exposure with danger, so every step toward intimacy also feels like a step toward possible pain. Their heart says move closer, while their fear says stay guarded. And until they learn that intimacy does not automatically lead to loss, betrayal, or emotional suffocation, they will continue living between those two opposing forces, the desire to connect and the instinct. T to escape. One of the most misunderstood things about avoidant individuals is the way they communicate emotional distress. Most people expect emotions to be expressed directly through words. They expect someone to say, I'm scared, I'm overwhelmed, or I need reassurance. But avoidants often struggle to communicate their emotional needs openly because vulnerability feels unsafe to them. Instead of speaking their feelings directly, they communicate indirectly through behavior. Their silence, distance, withdrawal, or emotional shutdown often says what they cannot bring themselves to verbalize. This is why many people misinterpret avoidance completely. They assume the person no longer cares because they became distant. They assume the relationship means nothing because communication slowed down. But in reality, avoidance is often an emotional defense mechanism, not an absence of emotion. The avoidant person may actually be feeling too much internally and not know how to process or express it safely. When avoidants feel emotionally overwhelmed, their instinct is usually not to move toward connection but away from it. They retreat inward. They isolate themselves emotionally. This withdrawal becomes a coping strategy designed to restore a sense of control. While other people may seek comfort during emotional stress, avoidants often seek space. Distance helps them regulate emotions they struggle to manage openly. For example, an avoidant person may experience fear after a deep emotional conversation. Instead of saying, that level of intimacy scared me, they may become quiet for several days. They may stop initiating contact or suddenly focus on work, hobbies, or independence. To their partner, this behavior can feel confusing or even hurtful. But internally, the avoidant person is often trying to calm emotional anxiety they do not fully understand themselves. Many avoidants learned early in life that expressing emotions openly did not lead to safety or comfort. Maybe their feelings were dismissed, criticized, ignored, or used against them. Over time, they unconsciously developed the belief that emotional needs should be hidden rather than shared. As adults, they continue carrying that pattern into relationships. They may feel vulnerable asking for reassurance, affection, or support because part of them believes needing others creates weakness or emotional risk. This creates a painful paradox. They desperately want understanding, yet struggle to explain themselves. They want someone to notice their emotional state without forcing them to expose it directly. They may secretly hope their partner can just understand what they are feeling without requiring them to say it out loud. But relationships cannot survive long-term on unspoken emotional needs alone. The challenge is that avoidance often sends the opposite message of what is truly happening internally. When an avoidant needs reassurance, they may act detached instead. When they fear about abandonment, they may emotionally withdraw first to protect themselves from potential rejection. When they feel hurt, they may suppress emotions entirely instead of discussing them. Their protective instincts convince them that distance is safer than exposure. Sometimes avoidants even confuse themselves because they become disconnected from their own emotions. After years of suppressing vulnerability, emotional awareness itself can become difficult. They may intellectually understand that something feels wrong while struggling to identify or articulate the deeper emotional cause. This is why some avoidants appear emotionally numb or disconnected during conflict. It is not always intentional coldness. In many cases, their emotional defense system automatically shuts down vulnerability before they can fully process it. Unfortunately, these patterns often create frustration in relationships. Partners may feel ignored, rejected, or emotionally abandoned. The avoidant individual may then feel misunderstood or pressured, causing them to retreat even further. A cycle develops where both people feel disconnected, even though connection is what both may actually want. Underneath the withdrawal is often fear, overwhelm, shame, or emotional confusion that has never been fully expressed. The silence is rarely empty. The distance is rarely meaningless. In many cases, the avoidant person is communicating loudly through behavior what they cannot yet communicate clearly through words. Avoidant individuals do not create emotional distance because they enjoy loneliness. Most of the time, those behaviors were developed as survival strategies. At some point in their lives, emotional self-protection became necessary. Maybe they learned that vulnerability led to rejection. Maybe emotional dependence resulted in disappointment. Maybe closeness once brought pain, criticism, instability, or loss. So they adapted by building emotional defenses designed to keep them safe from being hurt again. And the problem is that the same defenses that protect them from pain also block the very intimacy they secretly desire. This is the tragedy of avoidance. The walls that once served as protection slowly become barriers to connection. The behaviors designed to reduce emotional risk eventually reduce emotional closeness as well. Isolated while still deeply craving love and understanding underneath. While still deeply craving love and understanding underneath. One of the most common protective behaviors is emotional distancing. Avoidants often create space to calm their internal anxiety. Avoidants often create space to calm their internal anxiety. They may pull back communication, avoid deep conversations, become less affectionate, or focus heavily on independence. In their mind, distance creates safety. But from the other person's perspective, that distance can feel confusing, painful, or rejecting. The avoidant person may not realize that every time they emotionally retreat without explanation, they unintentionally weaken trust and emotional security in the relationship. Their partner may begin feeling unimportant, unwanted, or emotionally abandoned. This often creates conflict, pressure, or emotional pursuit from the other person, which then overwhelms the avoidant even more. As tension rises, the avoidant responds by withdrawing further, reinforcing the cycle they were trying to avoid in the first place. Another protective behavior is emotional suppression. Avoidants often minimize their feelings rather than expressing them openly. They may convince themselves they are fine even when deeply hurt, anxious, or emotionally overwhelmed. They avoid discussing emotional needs because needing support feels uncomfortable or unsafe. But emotions do not disappear simply because they are ignored. Suppressed emotions often resurface indirectly through irritability, emotional numbness, distancing, or sudden shutdowns. Over time, emotional suppression prevents authentic intimacy from developing. Real connection requires emotional honesty. It requires allowing another person to see fears, insecurities, needs, and vulnerabilities. But avoidants often fear that exposing these deeper emotions will lead to judgment, dependence, or loss of control. So they continue protecting themselves emotionally while unknowingly preventing deeper connection from fully forming. Some avoidants also protect themselves by focusing on flaws in relationships or partners. As intimacy deepens, their fear system becomes activated, causing them to unconsciously search for reasons why the relationship may not work. They may suddenly become hyper-aware of imperfections, incompatibilities, or minor frustrations. This mental distancing helps reduce emotional vulnerability because it shifts focus away from attachment and toward self-protection. In some cases, avoidants sabotage closeness without realizing it. They may delay commitment, avoid difficult conversations, send mixed signals, or maintain and emotional ambiguity. Not because they want to hurt someone, but because certainty and emotional dependence feel threatening to their nervous system. Keeping emotional distance allows them to feel more in control, even if that control comes at the cost of connection. What makes this especially painful is that avoidants are often unaware of how deeply these patterns affect their relationships. Many genuinely want stable love. They want peace, connection, loyalty, and emotional understanding. But the protective habits formed years earlier continue operating automatically beneath the surface. Their instinct to avoid pain becomes stronger than their ability to remain emotionally open. The deeper irony is this: the avoidant individual is often trying so hard not to get hurt that they unintentionally create the exact loneliness they fear. By avoiding vulnerability, they avoid the possibility of rejection, but they also avoid the possibility of fully experiencing love. By protecting themselves lives from emotional pain, they also block emotional closeness. The walls keep danger out, but they also keep connection out. And eventually, many avoidants begin realizing that emotional safety cannot be built entirely through distance. Because while avoidance may reduce temporary discomfort, it cannot create the deep intimacy the human heart continues longing for underneath all the protection. Healing for an avoidant person does not begin the moment they meet the perfect partner. It begins the moment they stop seeing vulnerability as a threat to survival, because at the core of avoidance is not a lack of emotion, but a deep fear of emotional exposure. The avoidant individual has spent years learning how to protect themselves from disappointment, rejection, abandonment, or emotional dependence. Those protective patterns may have helped them survive emotionally in the past, but eventually survival alone becomes exhausting. Human beings are not meant to only protect themselves. They are also meant to connect. The challenge is that real intimacy always requires risk. There is no relationship without uncertainty. There is no deep connection without emotional openness. And for avoidants, that openness can feel terrifying because it means lowering the defenses that once made them feel safe. Healing begins when they recognize that vulnerability is not weakness. It is emotional courage. Many avoidants believe strength means self-sufficiency at all times. They pride themselves on needing little from others. Independence becomes their emotional armor. But underneath that independence is often a fear that if they truly rely on someone emotionally, they will eventually lose control, lose themselves, or get hurt, so they avoid emotional dependence by staying guarded. The problem is that intimacy cannot grow where emotional walls remain permanently closed. Healing requires learning that needing connection is not failure. Wanting reassurance is not weakness. Expressing emotion. PES is not loss of power. In fact, emotional honesty often requires more strength than emotional avoidance. It takes courage to admit fear. It takes courage to communicate needs directly instead of hiding behind silence or distance. It takes courage to stay emotionally present when every instinct says withdraw. For many avoidants, vulnerability feels unsafe because they associate it with painful experiences from the past. Maybe they were dismissed when they expressed emotions as children. Maybe they learned that vulnerability was used against them. Maybe closeness became linked with chaos, criticism, inconsistency, or abandonment. Over time, their nervous system learned to treat emotional exposure like danger. That is why intimacy can trigger anxiety even when the relationship itself is healthy. Healing does not happen overnight because these patterns are deeply rooted. The avoidant person must slowly retrain themselves to experience connection differently. They must learn that emotion. Closeness does not automatically erase independence. They must learn that healthy intimacy allows space for both connection and individuality. Most importantly, they must learn that vulnerability does not guarantee rejection. This process often begins with emotional awareness. Many avoidants spend years disconnected from their own emotional needs because they became experts at suppressing them. Healing requires becoming honest about what they actually feel instead of automatically shutting emotions down. It means recognizing fear when it appears instead of disguising it as indifference. It means understanding that distancing behaviors are often protection mechanisms rather than true emotional desires. As avoidants begin practicing emotional openness, they often discover something surprising. Vulnerability creates connection, not just risk. Honest communication builds trust. Emotional transparency creates understanding. Asking for support does not always lead to rejection. In health, high relationships, vulnerability often deepens intimacy rather than destroying it. This does not mean avoidants suddenly become emotionally expressive overnight. Healing is gradual. There will still be moments where fear appears, moments where the instinct to withdraw feels overwhelming. But growth happens when they choose awareness over avoidance. Instead of disappearing emotionally, they learn to communicate discomfort. Instead of suppressing feelings, they learn to express them carefully and honestly. Instead of assuming closeness will trap them, they begin allowing themselves to experience emotional safety without immediately escaping it. One of the most powerful transformations for an avoidant person happens when they realize intimacy is not about losing freedom. Healthy intimacy is not emotional imprisonment. It is an emotional partnership that allows two people to remain individuals while also building trust, connection, and emotional security together. The avoidant individual oft. Penn spends years believing safety comes from distance, but true healing begins when they discover that real emotional safety is not created by avoiding vulnerability. It is created by learning that vulnerability can exist without destroying them.